Hello everybody! So when you're using a library, having good technical documentation is always a great thing. But what if you need to do it yourself? This is Stef from Samayas and welcome to my channel. Everybody knows the triple slash on your .NET code, right? Probably most people don't bother, however. Of course, if you're developing a website, that might seem less important than one if you're building a library which you might want to share. But from my point of view, the more you document things, the better it is. And that might be from starting with giving all your class names and method names clear and distinguished namings. Next, adding documentation on top of each of those methods, from describing the methods to all its parameters to potentially some examples and or remarks if needed. And in the final step, inside those methods, use clear variable names and leave some comments inside of your functions. Even if something is 100% clear today, you might need to review your code again in 6 months or 2 years, and then it might not necessarily be as clear as it is now. Now, the first part of the triple slash documentation, out of the box, Microsoft and .NET, when you activate it, generates XML files which can then be regrouped by third-party applications which can use it. One of those third-party applications that I've been using for a while is the open source project docfx. This tool allows you to build a complete documentation site for your library or libraries and can combine auto-generated documentation with written articles. So let's dig in. So I created a fake framework library wherein I created an entities directory, I created a base entity, both with nice documentation, a summary and a value for the properties, and parameters and or even exceptions for my variable names of the methods, etc. And I have 3 entities. I have a customer entity, order entity, and I have a product entity. Next I created a reportee. Next I created a repository directory and then a subdirectory interfaces where I first created a repository interface which has documentation, and then I created the in-memory repository which implements the iRead-only repository, and here as well I have documentation. For my constructor I have documentation, and for my getAll and my findById, which is already defined in my interface, I just need to specify my inherit documentation so that I don't need to copy that information twice. And then finally I have a services subdirectory with an order service, all the basics, again a constructor, a couple of functions, all with nice documentation. And then finally I have an order line and an enumeration, and each of those nicely received documentation. A typical standard project, which might be a library, but also a website or whatever. And finally, to make everything work, in my CS project files, I specified my documentation file. And then when I go to the bin.net 10 debug directory, it automatically creates for my library an XML file which contains all documentation. Next, for simplicity, the way I set it up is I created a docfx library, but it'll depend on your scenario. Whether or not you're documenting more than one library at once, or whether you don't even really need it inside that solution, but only need it in your CI pipeline. The previous version of docfx had an MS build task, and from my point of view, it was the easiest way just to build a new library which is never really used and which doesn't really contain anything, but which can be flagged as being dependent of all other libraries, so that you're sure that you only start building your documentation when everything else has been rebuilt. And the way to do that is to make sure that your docfx is referencing one or all your previous libraries. Now technically, if you only have one library to document, you could just call it immediately as a post-build step of your library you're documenting. Now, creating documentation itself is quote-unquote very complex. The base for creating your documentation is that you need to create a JSON file, which you need to call docfx, and there you follow a specific format. And in my scenario, first I specify my metadata. I include everything which is located under my FWK library, and I take all CSproj. I specify my source directory, which is the root of the solution, and I choose to exclude everything else. Everything which is in the object directory, in the bin directory, potential designers, and this project as well, should there be any code. And then after having specified the metadata, I specify the build, and I make a combination of the documentation which comes on one side out of the XML files from your libraries, and on the other side of the own documentation which you might have written. And so as a content, I specify everything which is located under my API directory. I take API YAML files, and I also take all potential MD files located under the API, MD files located under articles, and finally the root MD file, which is the index page, and the toc.yaml. As extra resources, I also take any potential images. Currently, I only have an icon, which is my logo for the browser, and I have an SVG, which is the logo which will be shown on top of the documentation. And finally, I have the possibility to use a number of global metadata parameters to specify the title of my documentation, the name of my documentation, the footer, which icon I'm using, what is my app logo, if I want to have content distribution, and whether or not I want to enable search. And finally, I still have a sitemap where I can specify the base URL on which this will eventually be published and the frequency at which that documentation is updated. So pretty easy, right? So once we have our docfx.json, next we need to add a number of MD files. In the root directory, we have our base MD file, which is your base landing page, where you can add extra links if you want. And then we have our TLC of table of content.yaml. And this TLC will be used in our banner for easily accessing other URLs. Depending on your setup, you might have subdirectories and sublinks if you want them. And then under my articles, I have again an index page where I can put whatever documentation I want. And I created an entities page where I can describe my entities. I created a repository page where I can describe my repositories. I create a service page where I can describe my services. And I have a TOC, or a table of content, specifically for the articles, which at every time will be displayed and will show me all the links which I've added. And the trick for this documentation to be built is that I'm simply using a post-build event, wherein I first call docfx and I call metadata, and then I built it. 2 command lines, and so technically you can easily run them from a command line and or specifically from a CI task if you would want this and if you'd want to keep it separate from a library. And then finally, I created 2 commands, a build command and a serve command. The build command is just a simple test to see that my JSON configuration and or all my MD files don't have any issues. The serve command is there to present a simple web server so that I can test my documentation side. So let's first have a run with the build. And very simple, everything is okay, everything is working. Now since I know that everything is working, now I'll do serve. And now after having built everything, I will simply have a web server running at port 882, which I can access on localhost to test my website. And so when I first start up my website, it's very simple. I have the logo, which I specified. I have a link to my articles. I have a link to my API documentation. And I even have a simple search. And I have my default index page where currently I don't have any extra links, but where I can put whatever I want. And so the base page, which is shown here, is the index page, which you see here in the root folder. Very simple, right? In the foot, as a footer, we also have the copyright. The logo here is present as well. And also, title of the page is what we pre-configured. Now if we go to the article page, we have our article index. And this is this page where I have 3 links and my articles. On the left side, we have our TOC, and this corresponds to this toc.md. And then I could click on this link on the index page, or I can click on my TOC. That's up to me. And the article part is a more static thing where you will really write your own documentation and or potentially link to classes you created. And the second part is the API documentation. And that's the dynamic documentation which is generated out of your XML file from your library. And here on the right side, our API documentation is this index.md, where again, you can put whatever you want. And then here again, we have a TOC, which is generated automatically. And for each of those classes, based on the documentation we provided in our code, well, it automatically generates this. And so for each of our objects, we have automatically generated code. And so finally, we have our search. If I just look for order, we immediately have a search where it shows all our pages. We have the word order. Very simple, right? And then finally, the whole goal of the exercise is to create a website which contains all of our documentation. And then once we have that website, the goal is to publish that one way or another on a web server so that users can access it. And the first step of that is that we have to go back to our docfx, and here we have an attribute destination where we specify where it will be built. And currently, and the default is _site. And if you go back to the docfx project and we show all files, well, we have a subfolder _site, which should be excluded from your source control, which every time contains everything what is necessary. And then it's up to you in your build pipeline to copy that to as an artifact somewhere, and then afterwards to have a process that pushes that site to your real website so that everybody can access it. Pretty easy, right? The moment you start to develop libraries for other teams, this is a must-have. And afterwards, it's up to you how you maintain, distribute, and automate the whole process. If you guys enjoy this content, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell sign. Or leave a comment down below.